What if the most dangerous technology ever hidden from humanity wasn't alien at all? What if it was something far more disturbing because it came from us? For decades, we've been obsessed with the Sumerian tablets and their stories of Enki, the god who supposedly engineered humanity. The narrative is seductive: an alien visitor, genetic manipulation, a hidden truth that explains our existence. But what if we've been asking the wrong question entirely? What if the real mystery isn't whether Enki was an alien, but what happens when a civilization realizes it can rewrite its own species and then chooses to cover it up? The Sumerian tablet that supposedly records Enki's final upgrade to humans isn't missing. That's not actually the mystery. The real story is something far darker. It's about what that tablet originally said, how it was deliberately mistranslated, and why the people who could read it chose to rewrite history rather than let the truth survive. Let me take you somewhere most people won't follow. In the early 1920s, after World War I, a particular group of scholars became obsessed with Sumerian texts, not because they cared about ancient history, but because they were hunting for evidence that selective breeding, genetic superiority, and directed human evolution were ancient technologies, not modern inventions. They wanted proof that it was possible. They wanted validation. The tablets that survived from Sumer tell us stories. Enki creates humans. Humans multiply. Enki interacts with humans. But there's something odd in the gaps. There are references to tablets that describe something called the final improvement. Ancient Sumerian scholars mention it obliquely. Other texts reference the work that cannot be repeated and the children who were separated. This is where traditional Sumerian scholarship stops asking questions. But why? Because in the 1930s and 40s, something shifted. Certain academics in Germany became intensely interested in these same texts. They saw something in the Sumerian descriptions of human selection and refinement that matched their own ideologies. The idea that an advanced civilization had deliberately shaped human species for specific purposes resonated with their terrible vision of eugenics. When this was discovered after the war, when researchers realized what these texts had been used to justify, there was a choice made in the academic community. A deliberate choice, not by everyone, but by enough people who controlled the institutions, the museums, the archives, and the peer review processes. They decided to compartmentalize the research. Translations of the most controversial tablets were hidden. Some were genuinely destroyed. Others were deliberately mistranslated into innocuous academic language that obscured their meaning. The full context of Enki's final upgrade was split across different museums, different countries, and different restricted archives so that no single researcher could ever see the complete picture again. This is documented, by the way. Academic papers from the 1940s and 50s reference translations that simply don't exist in the published record anymore. Citations lead nowhere. Researchers who tried to access these texts reported obstacles, institutional resistance, and mysterious accidental losses of documents. But here's what makes this genuinely terrifying, and what separates this mystery from the alien god narratives. The institutions that hid this information weren't protecting us from dangerous alien knowledge. They were protecting us from dangerous human knowledge. They were protecting us from ourselves. Because if the Sumerian tablets actually detailed a method, a reproducible method, for genetically directing human evolution, for selecting traits, for intentionally engineering not just physical characteristics but perhaps behavioral ones, psychological ones, then that knowledge becomes a weapon that doesn't need extraterrestrials, a weapon that humans can use on humans. And in the 20th century, especially after 1945, after the world had just witnessed industrial-scale atrocity justified by twisted theories of biological superiority, the academic community made a calculation. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve in a form that's accessible. What if that calculation was wrong? Because suppressing information doesn't make it disappear, it just makes it underground. In the 1950s and 60s, when the redacted translations became harder to justify, some researchers quietly began to reconstruct what had been hidden. They cross-referenced citations, they interviewed scholars who had seen the originals, they pieced together the story from fragments and gaps. What emerged was this: the Sumerian description of Enki's final upgrade wasn't about creating humans for labor. That narrative is the part they kept public. The suppressed part described something much more specific. It described the mechanisms of directed change. It described how certain traits could be accelerated or suppressed across generations. It described a system of intentional modification that was treated as repeatable, teachable, and, this is crucial, inevitable. In other words, it wasn't a story about ancient aliens creating us. It was a blueprint for how a civilization creates itself, refines itself, and shapes its own future. And by the 1960s, when the underlying ideas of molecular genetics were beginning to emerge in the world, when Watson and Crick were solving DNA, when the possibility of actually doing what the Sumerians had supposedly documented was becoming theoretically possible, by then, the decision to suppress these translations had already been made, reinforced, institutionalized. Now, we arrive at the real reason this information was hidden, and why it's still hidden today, though in different ways. If a civilization in ancient Mesopotamia genuinely possessed knowledge of genetic engineering, if they had techniques for directing human evolution that were detailed enough to be written down and transmitted, then two possibilities emerge. First, the knowledge was lost, and rediscovering it means we're just finding old blueprints for something we're going to invent anyway, except now we'd be reinventing wheels that ancient people already knew how to make. Second, the knowledge was deliberately suppressed from within that civilization. It was hidden, broken into pieces, made inaccessible on purpose, which would mean that some ancient culture, just like modern academic institutions, decided this knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. What does it mean if both ancient and modern civilizations made the same choice? And here's where we get to something almost nobody discusses. The tablet we're talking about, the one that supposedly records the final upgrade, was probably never meant to be found by everyone. It was probably meant to be found by specific people, future people who would recognize what it meant, future people who would be ready to understand it. The Sumerian libraries weren't archives for the public. They were archives for scribes, for priests, for specialists. The layered information, the deliberately obscure language, the sacred geometry that encoded technical information, all of it was designed to make sure that only people with specific training, specific knowledge, could decode what was actually being described. Which means the ancients already knew what we're only now learning. That information itself is a technology. That controlling who can access knowledge is a form of power. That sometimes the most important decision a civilization can make is not about what it discovers, but about what it chooses to remember and what it chooses to let disappear. For what it's worth, fragments of these hidden translations have surfaced over the decades. Academics in the Cold War exchanged them in secret letters. Soviet researchers, trying to beat Western science, attempted to compile them. Some made their way into classified research archives on human enhancement. Some found their way into the hands of transhumanist thinkers in the 1980s and 90s. Who became obsessed with the idea that ancient Sumer had possessed a detailed understanding of human genetic potential. But none of these fragments were ever compiled into the complete picture. The compartmentalization worked. the erasure was effective. If you dig deep enough into certain academic databases, into declassified research archives, into PhD dissertations from the 1970s that were barely circulated, you'll find references to something called the Enki Codex, a supposedly complete reconstruction of all the suppressed translations. One scholar claimed to have assembled it. He published a paper about it. His university revoked his accreditation. His research was declared unreproducible. He died in obscurity. There's a resource in the description and pinned comment that actually catalogs these historical records, the academic erasure, and the pattern of suppression that happened across multiple institutions during the 20th century. It's dense, it's weird, and it might change how you think about what academic institutions actually protect. But the deeper question isn't whether the Sumerians had genetic knowledge. The question is why we decided, as a modern civilization, to validate that suppression. Why did we accept that erasing information was the responsible choice? Because that's what happened. The academic community in the middle of the 20th century decided that preventing access to certain historical knowledge was ethically justified. They built institutions around it. They trained themselves to not ask questions. They created rituals of normalcy that disguised the suppression as standard academic practice. And if they made that choice about ancient knowledge, what's to stop us from making the same choice now? There's another layer to this that's even stranger. By the 1990s, when genetic engineering actually became a real possibility, when we genuinely had the tools to modify human genetics, the debate in academia didn't really engage with these Sumerian texts. It's as if they had been erased so thoroughly that modern ethicists, modern scientists, could discuss human genetic modification as if it were a new frontier entirely, as if there were no historical precedent, no ancient knowledge to learn from. Which raises a horrifying possibility. What if the suppression was so effective, so normalized, that by the time we had the actual technology to make these changes, we'd lost the wisdom that the ancient world might have had about why you shouldn't? Because here's what nobody talks about. If the Sumerians really did understand genetic engineering, and if they hid that knowledge, it probably wasn't because they were afraid of what others would do with it. It was probably because they had learned what happens when a society actually uses it. They had lived through the consequences, and they tried to warn us in the only way they knew how, by sealing the knowledge away, by fragmenting it, by creating a system where understanding it would require you to be wise enough to gather all the pieces and then decide, do I really want to know this? The tablet that we've been calling the record of Enki's final upgrade was probably not a technical manual. It was probably a warning about what happens when you succeed in engineering your own species, a warning about the social, psychological, and spiritual consequences of optimizing humans as if they were tools, machines to be refined rather than beings to be cherished. And the academics who suppressed it in the 20th century might have understood that on some level. They might have looked at the text and recognized something familiar in it, a kind of warning that resembled the warning the Holocaust had just written in real time, and they chose to hide it, perhaps thinking that if people never read the ancient warning, they might make better choices in the future. But that's not how warnings work. Warnings only protect you if you can learn from them. So here's where we are now, in 2024. We have the genetic tools. We're having conversations about designer babies, genetic optimization, human enhancement. We're racing toward the moment where we can actually make the changes that ancient Sumer supposedly knew how to make. And we're doing it without any historical knowledge, any ancient wisdom, any warning from people who tried it before. We're making decisions about reshaping humanity, and we've deliberately stripped ourselves of the context to understand what those decisions actually mean. And that's the real story of the Sumerian tablet. Not that it contains alien secrets, Not that it proves we're genetically engineered by visitors from space, but that it represents a kind of knowledge that threatens the way we organize power. It represents the possibility that ancient people understood something we're about to rediscover, and it was dangerous enough that we decided to erase it rather than learn from it. The question now is, do we repeat their choice? Do we suppress this knowledge again? Do we let genetic engineering advance without the historical context, the ancient warnings, the wisdom of civilizations that tried it and learned something important? Or do we finally open the archives, reconstruct the translations, and ask ourselves the hard question, why were we so afraid of these texts that we were willing to erase them from history? Because here's what I believe the real truth is, and I want you to think about this. The Sumerian tablet recording Enki's final upgrade probably isn't lost. It's probably been translated, decoded, and studied by people who never published their findings. It's probably sitting in a vault somewhere, read only by a small group of people who decided they were wise enough to possess that knowledge and we weren't. And the most disturbing part of that reality isn't that they're keeping secrets from us. It's that we decided that was acceptable. We decided that some knowledge was too dangerous for public understanding. We accepted that some people should know the truth and others shouldn't. That's not how wisdom works. That's how power works. If you want to dive deeper into the actual history of the academic suppression, the specific translations that disappeared, and what modern scholars are trying to reconstruct, there's an extensive resource in the pinned comment and the description. It includes primary source documents, academic papers that were supposedly lost, and a timeline of exactly when and why certain Sumerian research was restricted in different countries. I really encourage you to look at it because the pattern is fascinating and it applies to way more than just ancient texts. Thank you so much for watching this. It's a weird deep dive into something that most people never think about, and I really appreciate you being curious enough to follow it all the way. If you're someone who loves thinking about these kinds of questions, about knowledge, about power, about what gets hidden and why, then please